Welcome to this cinematic explainer. Today, we're stepping back in time, specifically into the late 19th century, to uncover the grand and honestly often brutal global theater of new imperialism. You see, this was an era where European powers, right alongside nations like Russia and Japan, aggressively raced to claim territories far, far beyond their own borders.
Now, European powers famously framed this expansion as a civilizing mission. That was the sweeping claim, that they were bringing education, law, and Christianity to populations they deemed inferior. French colonial policy even pushed this idea of assimilation, basically aiming to somehow transform colonized peoples into French citizens. But it set a dramatic stage built on a staggering ideological contradiction. They framed their overseas conquests as this noble effort, but as we're going to see, the reality experienced by the conquered populations was vastly, vastly different.
Here's our roadmap for today. We've got 6 parts: the drive for empire, justifications and realities, Africa, partition and resistance, India, the British Raj, China, unequal treaties, and finally, the legacy of imperialism. Let's dive right in.
The drive for empire, the industrial catalyst.
So to really understand how the map of the world was violently redrawn, we have to first look inside European factories. The Industrial Revolution in nations like Britain, France, Belgium, and Germany created an absolutely insatiable hunger for raw materials. I mean, think about the sudden invention of pneumatic bicycle tires in the 1890s. That alone set off a frantic, massive boom for rubber. To feed this economic explosion, they desperately needed these raw materials, along with brand new markets to sell their mass-produced goods. This demand, combined with the lethal advantage of new military tech like the Maxim machine gun and steam-powered gunboats, gave them both the motive and the means for global conquest. It even drove intense strategic competition, like Britain seizing Egypt in 1882, literally just to protect the Suez Canal route to India.
Part 2, Justifications and Realities, the Dual Perspective. As these European empires rapidly expanded across the globe, armed to the teeth with steam and steel, a really profound gap emerged between what they claimed to be doing and what was actually happening on the ground. The intellectual cover they used for this was called social Darwinism. It was an ideology suggesting that conquest somehow demonstrated racial and cultural superiority. And while European powers leaned heavily on this concept to justify being there, the lived experience of the conquered folks? Entirely different story.
Looking at European claims versus conquered realities, the divide here is incredibly stark. To the colonizers, this era was all about strategic competition, access to vast new markets, and immense national prestige. But for the colonized, it was a devastating loss of sovereignty. It was an era of outright dispossession and systematic subjugation. People lost their land, their political sovereignty was erased, and cultural traditions were actively destroyed, often right alongside intense pressure from Western missionaries to abandon their indigenous religions altogether.
Part 3, Africa, Partition and Resistance. The scramble formalized.
Our first case study takes us to the African continent, where the sheer arrogance of imperial ambition was put on full tragic display through a process known as colonial partition. Picture this, a map of Africa being unceremoniously carved up in a diplomatic boardroom in Europe. That's exactly what happened at the 1884 Berlin Conference. European powers just drew artificial borders, completely ignoring existing ethnic and cultural divisions. And the most shocking part? They established these ruthless rules for future colonial claims without consulting a single African leader.
The sheer scale of this scramble was absolutely devastating. You've got King Leopold II of Belgium essentially claiming personal control over the Congo Free State, right? He enforced a brutal forced labor system just to extract rubber, causing the deaths of millions of Congolese people under extreme, horrific violence. Meanwhile, down in the south, figures like Cecil Rhodes used corporate entities like the British South Africa Company to seize indigenous land and immense mineral wealth. Traditional subsistence economies across the entire continent were violently replaced by cash crop systems. It left local populations completely economically dependent and heavily exploited.
But you know, this narrative of absolute European dominance isn't the whole story. It's powerfully fractured by incredible moments of armed resistance. For example, Ethiopian Emperor Menelik II famously led his forces to a decisive victory over Italian invaders at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. Similarly, Zulu King Cetshwayo defeated a British force at Isandlwana in 1879. These historical moments prove beyond a doubt that indigenous forces could fiercely and successfully defend their homelands, turning the tide of the imperial machine, even if only temporarily.
Part 4, India, the British Raj. From company to crown.
Now, moving east to the Indian subcontinent, we see a totally different model of colonization. Here, an existing economic influence violently tightened into absolute control, establishing a system known as direct rule. India was already heavily influenced by the British East India Company, but in 1857, Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, launched an armed uprising against the company over policies that violated their religious customs. This was the Sepoy Mutiny. The uprising was ultimately suppressed, sure, but it led the British Crown to dissolve the company entirely and just take complete political authority.
Looking at how they tightened their grip on India, you can really track the timeline. After the mutiny in 1857, Parliament passed the Royal Titles Act in 1876, officially naming Queen Victoria the Empress of India. That symbolized complete British sovereignty over the subcontinent. But what's fascinating is seeing just how fast organized political pushback emerged. By 1885, Indian leaders had already founded the Indian National Congress to strategically coordinate political opposition against British rule.
So, what did the mechanics of this direct rule actually look like? Well, it was a hyper-efficient machine for economic extraction. Britain systematically dominated local cotton production. They forced Indian farmers into rigid indigo farming contracts and even imposed a heavy salt tax that deeply burdened everyday people. And yes, they built an extensive railroad network, but it wasn't for the benefit of the colonized. It was engineered specifically to transport raw resources straight to ports for export back to European markets. It completely flipped the economy upside down. India went from being one of the world's premier textile producers to simply exporting raw cotton, which caused widespread and devastating deindustrialization.
Part 5. China. Unequal treaties. The humiliation of an empire.
Our final regional study brings us to China. Now, entering the 19th century, this was an ancient and powerful empire, but it was subjected to a slow, devastating erosion of its legal and territorial sovereignty through what are called spheres of influence. European powers, along with Russia and Japan, didn't actually conquer China outright. Instead, they aggressively sliced it up into exclusive zones where each foreign power held dominant economic and political rights. It was this calculated way of carving up a sovereign nation while technically leaving its own government intact.
And this humiliation, it came in brutal waves. In the First Opium War between 1839 and 1842, Britain defeated China, forcing the Treaty of Nanking. That ceded Hong Kong and opened up Chinese ports to British trade. Then, the Second Opium War brought even further, harsher concessions. This series of unequal treaties basically stripped China of control over its own borders and laws. Ultimately, that deep humiliation fueled explosive resentment, culminating in 1900 with the Boxer Rebellion, where local forces violently targeted foreign missionaries and embassies before being suppressed by an international coalition.
Part 6. The Legacy of Imperialism, Resistance and Post-Colonial Impacts.
All right, so the era of new imperialism eventually collapsed under the weight of its own ideological contradictions. But man, its heavy footprint permanently altered the trajectory of the modern world. Across all three regions we just explored, the mechanics of foreign domination left lasting, undeniable scars. We see permanent impacts like that widespread deindustrialization in India, the deeply unequal treaties that haunted China's geopolitical stance, and those artificial borders in Africa that fractured ethnic groups and entire kingdoms. That created deep-seated geopolitical tensions that persisted long after independence.
But here's where the story takes a massive shift. Ironically, the very arguments of civilization were turned right back against the colonizers by Western-educated leaders. They passionately demanded self-determination, the inherent right of a people to govern themselves. Mohandas Gandhi used nonviolent civil disobedience in India. Intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois and Kwame Nkrumah championed Pan-Africanism, drawing on shared experiences of colonial exploitation to demand real freedom. And in China, these events planted the seeds of nationalist movements led by figures like Sun Yat-sen.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a big question to chew on. Considering the artificial borders drawn across Africa and the engineered deindustrialization of Asia, how much of our modern geopolitical map is still defined by the ghosts of 19th century imperialism? I mean, are we truly living in a post-colonial world? Or are we still navigating the chaotic blueprints drawn up by the architects of new imperialism? It's a massive concept to ponder, but understanding these structural realities is absolutely crucial to decoding the modern world. Thanks so much for joining me today.